the potential problem of the appeal to experts. In Plato's short dialogue, which bears his name, Socrates meets the poet Ion. Ion claims that experts in poetry are actually the most knowledgeable of all people because, since the poets wrote on every topic imaginable, the expert in poetry is therefore an expert on every topic. Socrates responds by asking him, if I had to plan a war, who should I consult, a poet or a general? The answer, even Ion must admit, is the general. If I had to build a house, who should I consult, a poet or a carpenter? Again, Ion realizes that the poet cannot give as knowledgeable counsel as a carpenter. By the end of the dialogue, we're left with a feeling that poets are so far from being the experts in everything, as Ion thought they were, that we must wonder whether they are experts in anything at all. Plato's well-known doctrine of experts crops up in many of his dialogues, but it's perhaps in Ion that it is most boldly put and forcefully defended. The idea is that we should not presume to believe that we are all experts in every area of life where we're called to make a decision, and so the wisest thing to do is to defer our judgment to those who have expertise in any given field. This advice seems to be even more appealing in our contemporary situation, since we have perhaps more areas of knowledge than ever before, and we can only become an expert in a very few of them. There are certain fields, such as theology, where anything resembling a consensus is hard to find, even if one were to restrict themselves to considering only Christian theology, or even a particular sub-tradition within the Christian theology. For such fields, it seems to be reasonable to expect every person to do just the best they can. If the experts can find no consensus, how can we expect those who are not experts to agree amongst themselves? Indeed, one might even raise the question whether there is anything there to be an expert about if there has been such a tremendous failure to reach consensus. However, there are other fields, such as many of the natural sciences, where consensus is the rule rather than the exception. I find a certain resonance with this idea that we ought to subject ourselves to the decision of the experts. I feel this way as a pastor. There's something about serving as a pastor that is so unlike other lines of work, which is even more the case, people's preconceptions about what a pastor does, that makes it very hard to feel like you're being judged fairly by those who have not and never have been, who are not and have never been pastors. In a similar way, it's difficult as an expert in training in theology to not hope that people will listen to you, not least because such training helps to reveal that things which seem simple on the surface are actually quite complex when you get down to it. This is not to say that people without formal training cannot have genuine theological insights, because I've seen over and over again that they can and do. But they might need a bit of help of theologians to articulate their convictions as clearly as possible. A theologian, at least in the times when they are more immediately connected to the work of the church, are kind of like the Socratic midwife, though the analogy should not be overstressed, guiding and assisting the people to bring out what they already know but have not yet been able to put into words. Aside from the conviction that everyone's lives would improve by always deferring to the judgment of experts, the ones who would be expected to be the most committed to such a practice are the experts themselves. After all, what better way is there to secure your authority, even in a narrow field, than affirming something like Plato's doctrine of experts? And yet it's often the experts in one field who are the very least likely to follow such advice. I've met some people who find this hard to swallow. Shouldn't achieving the expert status within a particular field make you all the more likely to defer judgment to the experts in other fields? After all, this is presumably the best thing for everyone. If the experts know best in their own field, why shouldn't they believe that the same is true in other fields? Here are my thoughts on why this is the case. It is speculative in the sense that I've done no actual research to back this up, but it is, I believe, philosophically and psychologically compelling, and seems to match up with the explicit and implicit concerns I have heard among experts in various fields, though most particularly in theology and physics, as that's where the lion's share of my experience is from. Experts in a particular field are wary of the decisions made by experts in other fields precisely because they know how authority functions within their own field, and it's not as noble as we might wish it was. What we would like to believe, and what many non-experts would have us believe, is that consensus, such as it is, within a particular field ought to be trusted because, if it is an academic discipline, it is represented in peer-reviewed academic journals. Articles in these journals are reviewed by the top minds in the field, with reviewers being selected purely on the basis of their expertise. Because of this, we can trust, we are told, the results of the peer review process. But there are a few potential problems with this way of presenting things. What if things aren't as clear-cut as this would lead us to believe? What if there were pitfalls at several places along the way? What if the review process is not always carried out by experts who are competent to judge what they are reading? What if they were recruited at the last minute because a more suitable reviewer could not be found? What if the reviewer is not an expert in a closely enough related field to the author's work, and so the gap between what the reviewer is competent to judge and the material they are being asked to review is larger than we might like? Given that journal articles are supposed to be breaking new ground in one way or another, this is not likely to be an entirely infrequent occurrence. What if, and here is the big worry, the journal's reviewers have been indoctrinated into one way of reading the data and so are inclined to reject an article that reads the data in a different way? We know this kind of prejudice happens, and happens with some regularity, and indeed takes place in a systematic way. When James Clerk Maxwell abandoned his attempt to explain magnetic phenomena from with the perspective of Newtonian mechanics, Lord Kelvin, a great scientist in his own right, accused him of lapsing into mysticism. The groundbreaking work by Thomas Kuhn and those who have followed after him has shown that not only do entire communities of scientists become indoctrinated into a particular way of understanding the world and attempting to fit everything into it, it is argued that this is necessary for science to do what it is attempting to do. Without a certain degree of indoctrination, to use what must sound to many as a very ugly word, consensus would never be reached, and any progress that arises in the sciences would be haphazard at best. So imagine the following situation. Suppose that the major journal or journals of a branch of science are run by senior academics who are heavily invested in a particular way of reading the data in their field. Suppose further that a young researcher comes along and proposes a bold new theory. We know that this happens sometimes, such as in the case of Albert Einstein and special relativity. That it is in significant tension with that of the previous generation. Now, if it were really true that scientists are always hoping that their theories will be proved wrong and they're always ready to abandon their theories at the drop of a hat when they're either demonstrated to be inadequate or replaced by a better theory, then we could conclude that the reviewers of such proposals would be fair and unbiased, and the better theory would, as a matter of course, be the one that wins the day. However, what if, perhaps through no fault of their own, the reviewers have a vested interest in portraying their field as having a certain consensus? Perhaps they're worried that if other ideas get taken seriously, their funding might be in danger. Perhaps they want to see their research vindicated by influencing public policy. Perhaps they believe that the dissemination of contrary views would put their hopes for tenure in danger. Perhaps for another reason altogether, but suppose that the group of scientists who control the academic journals and thus function as gatekeepers as to what is good science and what is not, therefore the ones who wield the real power of authority within the scientific community, were to systematically reject all papers which would tend to weaken their authority. This could easily be done, should the appropriate circumstances arise. Even if the opposing ideas were being submitted by more than one individual, they could be dismissed if they were only ever considered one at a time. The process could look like this. A bold new paper is submitted, but, upon comparison to the established consensus, is deemed to be too far afield to be considered scientific. It is thus rejected and never sees the light of day. It could be printed in another journal, but we're coming to that. Later, another theory comes to the journal. It, in turn, is compared to the consensus and rejected. This could go on indefinitely so long as the journals remain run by like-minded scientists. What would it take to get such deviant ideas published? It would seem that it requires an academic journal with a different set of values, one that will take risks, one that has less to gain by maintaining the status quo. But when you have an established consensus, and a new voice comes to the table, it's easy to see how this might be dismissed. So, an article or study was published which goes against the consensus? Well, where was it published? Oh, it was that journal. That journal only exists to try to overthrow the consensus. It's an upstart and is not to be taken seriously. If someone were to say, well, why not? Why should we not take them seriously? After all, it's peer-reviewed as well, is it not? The response might be, yes, but who are the peers reviewing the submissions? Scientists with an axe to grind, scientists bitter at being rejected from the main journals. Of course they're going to publish those kinds of articles. And so, since the thought of the status quo also represents a particular viewpoint, which is not necessarily rooted in truth, never crosses many people's minds, the upstart journal may be seen, perhaps indefinitely, as a decidedly second-class publication. It seems that what really is necessary to get a change in opinions is that a core group of experts who have all learned to play the game by the rules of the previous generation and can play it well have to become disenchanted with the status quo. They have to be good enough at the old ways of doing things that their names have the necessary authority in the field, or else they will come across as young and experienced hacks. Only then, it would seem, can new ideas be taken seriously. Now, someone might say, well, that isn't always true. Look at Albert Einstein. Even though he had a PhD, he was just a 26-year-old kid working in a patent office when his radical ideas were published. This is so. But it was unusual at the time, and it's utterly unheard of today. I'm not aware of anyone in any field having such a monumental impact on their field, setting it on an entirely new foundation, after being in the old one for over 200 years, and doing it as an independent scholar and at such a young age. I could have missed it, but it would seem that the reason the names are not well known is because there are none. So if there's any truth to these reflections, it might make sense why experts in one field are hesitant to defer judgment to experts of another field. Or we could take the line of Socrates and say, why shouldn't we trust the experts in their own field? We might also respond by saying, some of the most amazing papers and thinkers I've ever known have been rejected for all manner of reasons other than shoddy work. If politics, nepotism, and other non-academic factors can influence my field like this, what makes me think that they are not at work in other fields? Consider the situation expounded at length above. What is the difference to the outside observer between that and the development of a true and abiding consensus, not one not engineered by those in power? It's hard to tell what that would look like without an expert's immersion, and even such an expert might not be able to tell the difference because they're so caught up in the deception. And yet, though they are indistinguishable and the undesirable situation is certainly plausible, if someone were to suggest that there's a conspiracy, they would be treated as those who insist that there are conspiracies at work which tell us what to believe. Of course, we don't want to believe that this can happen to the scientists, do we? We're told that scientists are committed to the truth, that they're always the most self-critical of people, that they seek knowledge more than fame. But who says this? Scientists do, and even more frequently, philosophers of science. Is it not possible that they may not always be the most reliable narrators of their own stories? This is not an academic issue for them, no pun intended. It's playing for high stakes. Millions of dollars of research funding is at stake here, not to mention public opinion, tenure, and prestige. Human nature always reserves the right to rear its ugly head even in the most noble of professions. Find an expert and talk to them about how publishing and the granting of funding actually happens. Ask them whether they or anyone they know have never gotten creative with their presentation in order to secure one or the other. Ask them if they believe that the peer review process actually achieves what it attempts to achieve. This is not to suggest that we have a better or more infallible option. Ask them if there are any so-called consensuses within their own field that they reject, and why. You may find that Socrates was just a bit too optimistic about the authority of experts.